Hey everybody. Look, before we get stuck into this week's show, this is another one of those weeks where I've done a full interview and a cut down interview. We've had Louisa Dale, who is the Director of Insight from JISC, talking about this amazing report that was only published last week about reimagining learning and teaching in higher education. It's a great conversation. This is the edited version. There's also the full version, which is available as a separate video. Hope you enjoy it. Hi, Dave Coplin here, bringing you another weekly live stream. This time we are dialing into the future of work, looking again at education. I am absolutely thrilled and delighted to have this report hot off the press. This is from JISC, the organisation who works in higher education. It was a report that was published on the 4th of November. We're now on the 11th of November, and I am absolutely thrilled and delighted to have Louisa Dale, Director of Insight at JISC, who was the author of this report, with us in the studio today. Louisa, how are you doing?
I'm pretty good, thanks. It's been an intense 5 months, so I'm enjoying a little bit of downtime. This is how I like to spend my downtime, Dave.
Yeah, okay, thanks for that. You must be knackered. I mean, this report alone is an impressive bit of work. And I know that you, I mean, like you say, you've been working on it for months, but it isn't just you sitting in a dark room either. Talk to us about the report. We've actually talked about you before, not just you specifically, but just because you produced a report earlier in the spring, at the beginning, if you like, of the first phase of lockdown. Could you talk us through this report and how that differs to that one, and sort of give us some of the context about its creation?
Sure, and first of all, I need to clarify, it wasn't just me, obviously. I work at JISC, but we're also working in partnership with a range of organisations in higher education, but also and authors alongside Michelle Pawley, who's a really experienced writer in education technology, also David Maguire, who's interim principal at University of Dundee, and also JISC chair. He chaired Learning and Teaching Reimagined. So we set out in June as partners to help universities with targeted advice and guidance, peer support, but we were at the same time trying to gather insight on their immediate challenges, right? And in all honesty, we didn't uncover any real surprises, and I was grateful that you covered the interim report. You know, universities had obviously delivered tremendous response in shifting online. There was a lot of learning from that, but really what we uncovered was a collective lack of maturity in blended learning at scale, or online learning at scale. I mean, you see, we've got some notable exceptions, right? We've got a world-leading open university. So that was the difference. Change and challenge for students was really a short and sharp focused view of what had happened in spring. This report's different. This report sets out a roadmap for the future, we think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, we'll get into the sort of the roadmap and the recommendations towards the end, but there are a few pieces I want to pick up. The place I guess I really wanted to start is you call out 7 specific sector challenges, and it would be great just at a super high level if you could just position those, just so we kind of get a sense of where you think the roadblocks are, you know, the things that we're going to have to get through.
Yeah. So I'll give it a go. We identified 7 challenges, and they kind of emerged through August, September time in our research. You know, putting digital at the heart of university culture. Well, digital transformation reflects a shift, right, for any organisation. It's as much a people thing as a process thing and a technology thing being a technical term, of course. And so, you know, it requires attention. In terms of investment, there are pressures on university resources, right? There's pressures on any organisation at the moment through the pandemic. So balancing out investments between physical and digital campus will mean there are some really difficult choices to make. And we can't overlook the fact that a reliance on technology, a greater reliance on technology, is going to impact, and unfortunately we will see heightened exposure to cybersecurity incidents. So future investments require really close strategic attention at the most senior levels of a university. And alongside that shift in finances, we think that blended learning, quality blended learning, if it's to be affordable and sustainable, requires system-wide attention. Maybe we'll dig into what that means a little bit further on. For universities themselves, redesigning learning and teaching will present challenge, but it's as much a challenge as an opportunity, right? There's plenty of experts and lecturers that we engaged who are really positive about the change. They think bringing students much more closely into the design and delivery process has a lot more benefits and opportunities. So I don't mean just the typical student either, right? It's about considering all students and what their requirements might be. Onwards, I guess digital confidence is something that was striking throughout. There's not the depth of skills, and the research to date, even before COVID backed this up, there's just not the depth of skills and focus on digital as part of the academic toolkit or part of the professional services toolkit in a university. And increasing skills and confidence, we think, is really sort of will help unlock the challenge there. We've seen signs of improvement, but we think that onwards, as we recover as well, it's going to be really important to ensure that we're kind of keeping staff and students motivated to maintain their kind of attention and focus on digital and kind of enhancing the learner experience, not just to kind of fall back and be thrilled that, the pandemic's over. So there's also kind of, attitudes are changing, but there's some myths to bust about online. It's perceived to be cheap or an easy alternative, and that's not necessarily the case. And online is part of blended, and we kind of think that universities themselves can help by communicating benefits, but also addressing some of the things that actually appear to be problematic. And, we've learned a lot through COVID. It's been really interesting to see where students feel value. They've missed social connectedness. They really value aspects of the campus experience so much more than anyone that works in universities really thought. So understanding and helping universities or universities themselves kind of being more clear about what's attractive and appealing in the experience, just going to heighten and broaden their appeal, right? And finally, digital poverty. It's a significant issue and needs some really careful and focused attention right now. There shouldn't be barriers such as this to higher education that we see today.
So look, let's very much switch gears now. I want to talk to you sort of about strategy on an institutional level. And one of the challenges you called about this need to invest in the short term with a view to the long term. And in the report, one of the bits that I thought was really good, and I'm used to seeing reports about the future. I spend my life at 50,000 feet, 20 years in the future, with no idea how to get from here to there, right? So you not only talk about a strategic framework, you also provide one. Talk us through that. What kind of tools have you built to help institutions build their strategy?
Yeah, I think that's one of the things we're most proud of with this piece of work. So we're just not just positioning what's possible. We are giving tools for university leaders, but those involved in university change, the ability to stop and think. So we frame some questions, not the answers, right? So we've tried to answer 3 questions with supporting resources. So one, what does the future look like? Well, we don't claim to know the answers. I've talked earlier about we might not have the best perspective right now when we're in the middle of a pandemic, but we've shared some visions and some scenarios to help inspire. So we just asked university leaders, and we've asked some ed tech startups, and we're wide open, actually. Any of your viewers are interested in sharing. We're still looking for those visions of 2030, because we think it's really important to have a look at what's possible, what's preferable, and kind of shape a future through that. And so the very act of creating a vision of the future, actually, one university leader in particular said was just hugely energizing. It just took him to a different place and really helped him, motivate him. So it can be really enjoyable. The second question is, what do I need to know now? We've created some primers, right? It's a very education term, right? The foundational guides. Know your audience. So we had some really candid conversations with university leaders. They just said, we don't get some of the basics here. They just don't have the fundamental knowledge of technology because they've never needed it before. It just wasn't parcel of their business. And there's an awful lot of geek speak out there, or kind of, sales stuff, and they just wanted something that helped cut them through. And not just about technology, about, technology enhanced learning too. So we've created some primers, we'll create some more. We've also created some, collated some of the best advice and guidance that we can find, and want to signpost those for those doing a deeper dive. And then the third one is hopefully the most substantial, is a strategic framework, which really doesn't have the answers, but sets out the key questions that leaders need to make. We're very aware, we identified really early on that leaders were interested in reshaping their strategies or developing an investment case. And so we've set those out. We've also, because we feel that developing strategy is a collaborative thing, right? It might be for the likes of you, Dave, that sit in your glorious ivory tower of isolation and kind of think about the future. But we think that when you're actually shaping strategy, way better to do it collaboratively. And knowing that a lot of people would have to do it remotely, we kind of went into the JISC archive for that and pulled our experts together, and they've created some tools, some collaborative sessions that just help you bust open some of the thinking. There's very much design-led thinking in the mix there, because we think that'll really help. Start with your purpose, start with your users, and kind of build out from that. So hopefully they'll be useful too. Time will tell, of course.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think absolutely they will. And I think what I loved about that right at the beginning is creating a source of inspiration and aspiration, because we desperately need that right now. And I would imagine if it's anything like the world of work, having a sort of a whiff of optimism about what we might do as a result of the terrible circumstances to come out of this a bit better off. What's not to like about that, to give you the context for what the changes that you might need to make. But we talk about this again, it comes back to money, doesn't it? And again, you talk in the report about most institutions had to spend anywhere between $1 million to $3 million just to cope with the early phase of the pandemic, never mind the sort of the longer term implications. Is that the challenge with digital? Do we see digital as being this continual sort of cycle of investment? Is it something that, becomes cheaper over time? How do you see that playing out?
It requires continual investment. The nature and shape of that depends on the level of the ambition of the university. I mean, that's being really glib, but it's true. One of the interesting things, we really struggled to find evidence of where and how universities spend their money on digital elements of learning and teaching, because it's not tracked and understood in those terms. It was pretty easy to find how much money they spent on their physical campus. It was also pretty easy to find out how much they spent on elements of IT, but not actually specifically for learning and teaching. And so we could make an estimate comfortably based on speaking with some leaders about how much they might have spent in the emergency response. But then onwards, we really feel that it needs quite some considerable effort to understand and explore and consider kind of what the profile of that onwards investment is. And we talk about, the difference between physical and digital. We just think there needs to be balancing up and out, to acknowledge and respond to the fact that digital is probably more important to them than it was previously, and therefore they need to invest accordingly.
When you launched the report, we had Professor Anne Carlisle, who's talking about the shift that's happening in terms of students. And I'm just going to read it because it was quite a lovely quote. She talked about putting the student at the centre, but specifically she talked about the shift from learner to user, where students are no longer vessels to be filled with knowledge, but are instead an integral part of the collective experience. I thought that, well, to me, that felt quite profound in terms of the change and the sort of the cultural change that's at the heart of what's happening in universities. And I'd love to know a bit more about that. I mean, what does that mean for institutions, for lecturers and staff? And what does that mean for leaders as they try and sort of navigate that?
I think it's a big deal. I think it's a really big deal. And we've talked a bit about Anne. She's not the only one, but she has very clear in her views that she thinks this is an opportunity. And I've got to say, personally, like, why wouldn't you want to involve students? You talked to yourself earlier, Dave, and they're like smart, they're highly engaged, they are kind of, they want to be involved and more involved. They're very clear on that. Well, harnessing that energy and impetus could take you to who knows where. So there's huge potential huge untapped, or there's huge untapped potential there. And I think that's just the start, really, and how university leaders want to go about that, and academics want to go about that, they need to think about. I mean, I think one thing that's important to say is, it's not the students aren't the pedagogic experts, but as users, you wouldn't expect them to be, right? But they've got a perspective and they've got something to offer. And so already we've seen students play different roles in learning and teaching, and kind of more of that, as suits. But it's part of this experimental phase I think we're in right now. That's exciting. That's really exciting. Yeah.
So look, let's shift then into sort of the recommendations and conclusions of the report, and I think they were really interesting. So you call out 9 recommendations, and I'll put them up on the screen so the viewers can see. But can you just sort of at a really high level, just walk us through what you felt the main recommendations were?
Sure. So it's fairly obvious stuff, I guess. And you've got to remember we're making recommendations for a whole sector that's very diverse. It's so the points of emphasis, I guess, are as such. You think carefully about what it'll take to transform the talent, the culture, the approach. It's just fundamental, but it's really important. In terms of investment, there's hard choices to be made, and making sure that there's solid information, that they're focused on long-term ambitions, that avoids knee-jerk, but also is prepared to take risks, because there's not an extensive set of evidence to base this stuff on at scale, as we've talked about. In terms of cybersecurity, it was our advisory board that was so clear that cybersecurity got prominence in the recommendations. So these are like 12 vice chancellors or equivalents, and so interesting that this is a requirement from them, because
I was really surprised to see that, like as high up as it was. I mean, it's obvious, but it's still, it was,
but it's also a global problem right now, and not one that's going away, and it's an expensive problem too, which is why it's so high up. And we talked earlier about thinking radically, need to think about where we spend monies and consider opportunities to shape a sustainable and affordable response. Accelerating blended learning, well, scaling up in all senses, right? Huge amounts of expertise exist, but it's a matter of going large, and inevitably that brings with it some challenge. Inclusivity and accessibility, I'm just thrilled that these are something that we've secured unanimous support for, because, and personally I'd go further, right? So this isn't just about inclusivity and accessibility for students with additional needs, or even those with particular preferences, right? In future, this is more important as universities consider personalised learning. It's the learning for the individual, and it's their outcomes as individuals that goes beyond anything else of importance, right? Now that's not easily done, but really important, and gained huge support from those we engaged with. Confidence, we talked quite a bit about confidence. So confidence is key, and supporting everyone in their use of technology. And some of the barriers right now aren't simply confidence. There's matters of design or execution that come into the mix, but it can all be helped enormously by a bit of focus on confidence and ensuring that the provision matches expectations. So this is about research of prospective students as much as in-course students, and understanding how Generation Z learners are different to millennial learners, are different to boomers, and those are broad brush and problematic categories. But actually, if you have clarity about who your target market or markets are as a university, we shouldn't make too many assumptions, but it can be quite helpful to have a sense of what the differences are based on their experience within that generation, right? And I don't mean by this at all that Generation Z are digital natives, right? There's been a lot of research, enough said there, but right, they've had and they come with a particular set of experiences. Right now, they're moving from Fortnite into Among Us, and that's really interesting problem-based stuff right there. Yeah. So their expectations, their world is changing, and the university needs to shift accordingly to be attractive, right? So you can tell my fun space, this is a really interesting space. And then finally, a fundamental, we talked at the top right about digital poverty. It could not be more important. It could not be more difficult, but it needs to be dealt with, and dealt with at scale. There shouldn't be barriers to higher education. It's why I work in higher education, to ensure that the benefits of and the possibilities are open to all. And as a country, we've made significant commitment and inroads to ensure that higher education was accessible. And unfortunately, right now, through COVID, through nobody's design, that barrier is there, and it needs resolving with swift attention.
And yeah, look, so you've just laid out all of those. I want to pick up on the last one first, and then we'll go backwards. But so talk to me about digital poverty. It's not uniquely your problem, but what are the things that uniquely higher education can do to contribute to its eradication?
Well, universities are taking measures. They're setting up special funds. They're kind of learning better how to assess students coming into a course, especially if special kit is required or special software is required, just kind of dealing with that right from the outset. But there are issues in the pandemic of space as much as there are access to data, as much as there are to kind of all of the other parts. So a highly unusual set of circumstances that they're pretty stretched right now to respond to. So JISC, along with other organisations, have shared to government, and government are considering the options. And in the devolved nations too, they're looking at apportioning funding. So funding has been made available, but the response varies depending on the devolved nation and government administration. So we're looking for a more robust response here. There's a very polite expression for it.
Yeah, no, I know, but it's hard, isn't it? And I sort of, it's a very emotive subject for me. But it's really hard to nail down, and it's something that I think over the next, well, certainly the remainder of my career, I would love to try and find a way to move this forward, because wherever you are in society, and we always have this same conversation about, digital poverty is a real problem, isn't it? Yeah, it's a terrible problem, it prevents us, and then still nothing happens. And I just think, well, actually, I'm not going to trivialize it, but I'm not sure that it's that difficult. There are things that we could all do from our respective positions to solve it. We just need to crack on. It needs to become important enough for us to solve it. That's the issue. Yeah. So then let's talk. So the recommendation I really love, because there's, again, you're dealing with a very broad spectrum of institutions who are at different places on this journey, have different aspirations about where they want to be. What happens if people aren't able to make this journey, either are unwilling or simply don't invest in it in a big enough way? What's the outcome of that for an institution?
It's so early to say. I mean, I'll be clear, we only framed our recommendations for the relatively short term to help universities for 21-22. Onwards, there'll need to be further effort and intention. And that's because, as I've said, we just don't have the perspective right now in the pandemic, but we're also in this situation of tremendous experimentation. Well, we should expect to learn and adapt as we go forth. And I think some might not necessarily make the transition or the transformation in learning and teaching. They may feel that their offering is distinct and sufficient without it. That's going to be interesting to see how prospective students respond to it, and that will tell us, right? That will tell us. Maybe there will be students that will always and forever want only in-person learning and nothing else. I'd be surprised if students only and ever want in-person learning with a physical textbook and a physical book. That would be unusual, but let's see how it goes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The PR part of me wanted you to use the phrase "adapt or die," because that's typically.
Well, Dave, I'm the geeky researcher. You're the show guy, right?
So there you go. Adapt or die. Sorry, that was very pointy. So again, one of the nice things about the journey that I've been on with trying to tell all of these stories or understand all of these stories is looking across education and sort of seeing some similarities. And actually, maybe I'm in a better position than you to answer this question. But what I was going to say, do you think there's lessons that other parts of the education world could learn from the research that you've done and the experience that you've had in higher education?
Yeah. So it was remiss of me not to talk about it earlier, but actually I helped, I worked with Robin Gerberin, who's JISC Managing Director for Further Education. We framed a similar piece of work. It ran differently because the context's different and stakeholders are different, but we ran a similar piece. They're doing some deep dives now, but the first phase of that research found pretty much the same as we found in higher education, right? Pretty much.
Yeah.
And so lessons and preferences and expectations of the future, a shift in perceptions of what digital can do for learning and teaching. All of that is there in colleges. Much less well informed about what's happening in the school space, although I have the delightful experience of my kids self-isolating, so I'm learning a lot about homeschooling right now in secondary school education, right? And yeah, there's a lot to be there's a lot of commonality, we suspect, at the heart of it, because it's a transformation of the learning and teaching experience.
Yeah. I think so, and certainly the conversation we've been having at a sort of K-12 secondary school perspective is very similar in terms of the bit that really resonated me with the work that you've done is this whole thing about skills and confidence. That's absolutely crucial to this because it is a cultural shift, and even in anecdotally in my own experience as a parent of a teenager at school, you can see the culture of different teachers massively affects the outcome of what they're prepared to do. We've had a really interesting thing where there was a massive amount of pushback about doing tests remotely. I hadn't anticipated at all, but it was a massive cultural roadblock that we had to navigate, where we simply can't do the tests remotely. And I'm like, well, why not? And then, of course, you get into the culture of it, and you get into the sort of the concerns people have about whether it's from cheating through to the sharing of the material and all that sort of stuff, which, again, I'm sort of oblivious to, but you learn more. But I think it is this sense of helping the human beings at the heart of this experience on that journey. And I think there's a lot that they could learn from the research that you've pulled together, and the stories, of people who are on this journey and are learning it. So I will certainly be recommending that. Now I'm going to ask you this really ridiculously obvious and stupidly simplistic question, which is what all interviewers do at the end, right? And what's the one thing that you would, so bear with me, right? So the point is that, it is broad ranging and there are lots of things to do. If I'm an institution and I'm sitting there thinking about this stuff, what's your best advice about where to get stuck in and where to get started on this? And I get that that's a ridiculously large question, but just sort of point me in the right direction.
Yeah, sure. Back to the commonalities of digital transformation, right? What makes the biggest difference in digital transformation? It's culture, it's the people. They are motivated, they mobilize, they hull up the problems, and then they figure out some of the solutions. So, I'm no university leader, right? So I get excused from this, but I think as you've asked, it's about ensuring you have talent and allow that talent, support that talent through change and shaping onward change. And expect that things will work and differently than they have before, and that timescales will shift. And something that goes right to the heart of universities. I haven't really expressed it really well because I might kind of mentally think, oh my god, this is a big difference for a university to make. They pride themselves on the kind of quality and depth and amount of consideration and amount of time. And so it's going to be important to learn and adapt, but at the same time not throw away the things that make a university as brilliant as it is. So it's one to handle really, really carefully. And I don't envy university leaders this challenge, but with talent, they can shape whatever future or vision of the future they want.
Yeah, I love that, Louisa, and I think there's so much about this, and it feels almost trite and glib to say this, but it's all really about the humans at the centre of this, and you know, having confidence in them, and again, I do believe, you know, probably more so than any other organisations, you are united by a common goal. All right, there might be a conflict between research and learning, but you know, broadly speaking, we're trying to advance knowledge. And that's an opportunity. So being able to embrace that and having the confidence and trust to
Yeah.
make that happen, I think that's really important. So on that note, Louisa, I mean, I just want to say thank you for joining us and spending a considerable amount of time with us. You must be knackered after, you know, working through this report. So I think I really, really appreciate that you took time
Thanks,
to share
Dave.
that with
It's
us.
total pleasure. Thanks for asking me.
Oh no, it's great, and what I'll do is I'll put a link to the report in the comments below, so you'll get access to that. I really encourage you to sort of engage with it, and not just from a higher education perspective, but in sort of learning the transition or trying to understand the transition that we're all going through. I think that's really helpful for us all to be able to play our part. And so on that note, let me just say thanks again, Louisa, for joining us. It's been a massive pleasure to have you on. And then all that leaves me to say is thank you so much for joining us. What we'll do, as we've done in the past, is we'll do 2 editions of this. We'll do the full, unedited, if you like, conversation. And then I'll also do a shortened version for those of you with short attention spans or, frankly, better things to do. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll be back and we will see you again next week.
There are 1,000 stories in the Envisioners' future. This is just one of them.